from our studios in where am I? Oh, I'm in Tokyo, and Scott is in Tampa, and he's joining us live from the Hurricane Milton. Scott, can you hear us, Scott?
No, it's over. It's over. It's done. It's actually a beautiful day outside. If you don't look around to the right or left on my street, where you see all the downed trees and damage, I will say that being in I had a unique experience with Milton because I was actually not in Tampa when it happened. I was in Orlando because my mother got evacuated. However, Eric, my husband, did ride out the storm here in Tampa, so I have that perspective as well. And then when I got back, the aftermath. People think of the storm as the horrible part. What they don't think about is the aftermath. And quite honestly, the aftermath is what is really the worst. Because you've got people who have completely lost their homes, and these are people who live within blocks of my house. But we live in an older neighborhood that has giant oaks, and so many of them have come crashing down. And we were incredibly lucky because we had some minor damage to our fence in the backyard. And we have a little bit of a roof leak in my office but of course the house is 100 years old, so that's expected. And then we had a couple of cracked branches that are being held up by other branches, so we're trying to get some tree experts to come out and take care of that. But all in all, we never lost power here in Tampa, and there are people who are surrounding us. And this is being recorded on Sunday, what is today, the 13th? Yeah. Sunday the 13th. So there are people all around us who still do not have power, have not had power since the storm hit. The only thing that we are lacking here in our house is internet. We have no internet connection, so I'm doing this via my hotspot. So that's why you're not seeing us today. You're just hearing us. So
Yes. I didn't mention that at the top of the show, but yes, the reason that we are doing audio only this week is obvious, is because Scott is without Wi-Fi, but also it's in the middle of the hurricane. It's a pretty big deal, and that's why we wanted to talk about it right at the beginning of the show, because it was the big news story of this week that impacted all the attractions.
Well, and it's interesting because it's impacted the attractions in slightly different ways. And once again, I think the aftermath is what's really going to be the majority of this discussion. But as you know, or as many of you know, there was if you were outside the country, there was a very large hurricane, probably the largest, definitely the largest since. What was the last one that came through here that was this devastating? It's been like 20 years, but it's really second largest hurricane in the history of Florida. It came in. It made landfall just south of Tampa. It did not come up into Tampa Bay, which is a blessing for both my house and Busch Gardens. And then it came in as a Cat 3, and it was still a Category 1 hurricane by the time it left on the Atlantic coast. So it went all the way across Florida as a full-blown hurricane. It did not downgrade to a tropical storm after it made landfall. So its pathway took it really right across Universal, right across Disney, and then out the other side. I got a chance, because I was evacuated to Orlando at about 4 a.m. to ride the eye wall for a moment or two, and when the trees are basically blowing sideways and the rain is horizontal. And then it shifts direction. It's kind of weird because as it passes, the rain shifts direction, for those of you who've never been through a hurricane. But Disney was wise and closed at 2:00 in the afternoon on the day that it was supposed to hit. And then, like I said, the eye wall hit about 13, 14 hours later. Universal closed a little bit earlier to give people a time to do a little bit more prep. And both are back open. Now, I do not have a report. Philip, I don't know, maybe you've heard. I do not have a report on the damage from either Disney or Universal. Have you heard anything?
Well, to my knowledge, they haven't released really like a public statement. Just to my knowledge. I mean, I did not find a public statement on the amount of damage, but I don't think that's I don't think that's something they're really going to do. I have seen a lot of anecdotal posts from folks who are in the industry about some projects that were derailed. I've heard some stuff about the some concerns about the job site for Epic Universe, and some items like that. But I think, to your point, the aftermath, a lot of this stuff, I don't think we're really going to know for a little bit, because take, for instance, the Lagoon show, right? Those, we didn't really know immediately, or, it wasn't clear immediately what sort of audio visual damage is on some of those items for a while. Speaking just from the manufacturing side as well, sometimes it takes a while for you to really realize if you have outdoor lighting, where the water has ingressed into certain areas, or you have signal backage or whatnot from some of your DMX lines. So,
or all your DMX controllers, whatever you're using to protect them from the elements, that got blown away, which is very possible, or has developed a leak.
Exactly.
I mean, I will say that on the East Coast, I mean, there was a time where you could not, if you were in the, they showed some really interesting footage from the International Space Station, and there was a time where you could not see the state of Florida because it was completely covered by a hurricane. So it basically engulfed the entire state. What I don't think is going to get reported a whole lot is prior to the hurricane's arrival, prior to it making landfall on the west side of the state, the east side of the state they had at one point in time, they had counted up to 90 different tornado warnings on the east side of the state. And the first fatalities from the storm happened actually in St. Lucie County, which is on the eastern side of the state. They were showing pictures of airplanes that had been, private airplanes that had been flipped over, and some rather significant tornado damage there. So that's, if anything's going to impact the theme parks, I'm guessing that they got hit by those, and then just got a 1-2 punch. If they had any tornadic action, any tornadoes that went through, it would have been a 1-2 punch happening. The first punch happening probably around 6 or 7 p.m., and then the second punch coming at 4 a.m. the following morning when the eye came through, because the eye did come through very, very close to Orlando.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think I'm curious to know, Scott, what you thought about. I guess the different responses, because what I heard from some folks, like some, I guess more like cast members or folks like in on the front lines, was that they felt that Disney's reaction was pretty slow comparatively, or I guess slow to close, and then or faster to reopen. So, kind of on both ends, right?
I've heard the same anecdotal issues, fast to close, slow to close, fast to open. And they're blaming that on their desire to make money. And, but there's a couple factors that I don't know whether everybody's taking into consideration. I agree, actually, on the slow to close, simply because, we look at, if you're not in it, you look at the storm only in the time that the eye is present. And that is completely unrealistic. Prior to, you want to make sure that you have plenty of prep time, not just for your parks, but for the people who work in your parks, because their homes are going to be around your park. And if your park is in danger, their homes are in danger. So not closing, they didn't close, to my knowledge, until 2 p.m. on the day that the storm hit. And it made landfall in Tampa at almost a little after 8 o'clock, somewhere between 8:30 and 9 that day. So they were calling it pretty close as far as the closures go. As far as reopening, once again, thinking about not just focusing just on their employees first, and then I'll focus on the guests in a moment, but focusing just on the employees, reopening, they opened the day after, I believe. I don't know that for a fact. We'll have to confirm that. But they opened shortly after, and for the employees, for the cast members, these cast members were dealing with flooding and trees down and potential damage. Not to mention, and this has been the biggest challenge that I've been facing, is access to gasoline. Since I was with my mother, and we evacuated from her house, which is in Hudson, Florida, which is about an hour north of Tampa, all the way over to Orlando and back, all of my quote unquote emergency fuel that I had put in my gas tank was pretty much used up. Driving over there and then driving back, which took 5 hours because roads were flooded or closed or whatever. So even just getting gasoline in order to drive to work for employees is a challenge across the state. Now, it's worse here in Tampa, obviously, but is a challenge across the state. Now, let's flip our focus from the employees to the guests, because let's not kid ourselves that there were plenty of people who rode out the storm in Disney and Universal property hotels, and in fact, one of my options when we were evacuating was one of the Universal properties. But when they've got to take care of their guests as well and figure out how much they can hedge and guide and refocus. One of my favorite anecdotal stories was at Disney. They actually shifted those members of some members of the mascot crew, the costume character crew, over to the hotels and did a ride-out team with them, so that some of the iconic characters were able to keep the kids, the friends of iconic characters were able to keep kids comfortable and calm during the actual storm itself. Now, again, there was storm activity prior to the eye passing at 4 a.m., but hopefully most of the children were sleeping. So, but still, they had to they had to balance. I can't say whether they did the right thing or the wrong thing simply because I wasn't there. But if you look at it from the standpoint of the employees, they closed too late, in my opinion, and they reopened too early. Looking at it from a guest standpoint, I understand exactly why they wanted to do it, and who knows, they may have looked for volunteers to come work, saying, if you're available to work or if you haven't had any damage or whatever, then please come in and help take care of our guests. So it's a unique balancing act for that sort of thing. Now, Busch Tampa, which is scheduled to open, as we're recording this, scheduled to open in about 15 minutes on the 13th at 10 a.m. They're scheduled to reopen. I know that Zoo Tampa, which suffered significant flooding situation and quite a bit of wind damage, is not going to reopen until the next weekend. So there has been, it's that cleanup that's becoming more and more challenging. I was able to get gas. The first time I was able to get gas since the storm was this morning. I got up early and went to a gas station not too far from us. Had to wait a half an hour in line, but they were one of maybe 3 gas stations within a 10-mile radius that had any sort of gas at all. So, it's not just the fixing of the storm stuff, but it's also the fuel, and not only the fuel for cars, but the fuel for generators. Attractions, of course, have been running on generator since they lost power for the storm, whenever that was. So they're having to get out to find fuel as well. I know that there were a couple that I had heard anecdotally were having some challenges. They were running lower than they wanted to on their fuel supply. So, it's not just the wind. It's not just Jim Cantori, where is he, and standing in his parka as the wind blows him sideways. It's what happens after that is this. We'll be recovering from this, and I'm sure that many of the attractions will be as well. But we'll be recovering from this for several months, if not a full year.
Yeah. Well, we I think the last thing I kind of wanted to add was on the subject of recovery. This comes right immediately after a previous storm, right? And so I think it's one of those things where if this keeps happening, right, where we're having storm upon storm upon storm without the adequate recovery time, I think that's going to just compound the problems. And it does, like Scott's saying, it does take a while. I mean, our office is in Orlando, and we were also lucky. We had very little structural damage. There were leaks and everything, but none of our product was damaged. However, water did come in. We sandbagged the wall, but water did come in, and so now it's taking days of dehumidifiers, and you got to clean the carpets, and you imagine that, but in every building, all everywhere, and then when another one hits so rapidly, it again, it's on the heels of another one. So I think this goes back to what Scott had talked about crisis management way back when we talked about the pandemic, right? This is the same instance where it's time to revisit our hurricane plans, and I think it's never been this bad at our office, at least, and for our employees. And so even I can see, but I don't need them to go in, right? I can let them, stay home or do whatever they need to do. But that's not a luxury that attractions have. So I think it might be time for a lot of folks to revisit the plan and figure out what you're going to do, like Scott said, with your employees. If they what happens if they can't get to work because they don't have gas, and then they can't, they don't have water at home, or they don't have electricity. It's a real concern.
Well, and I think it's also something that we have to take into consideration looking at the coming months as far as attendance goes, because if there were people impacted,
it's going to scare people, right? Scare.
It's going to scare people. It's going to scare people from traveling to the state of Florida. It's also going to the people who are living here, who are, the last thing they want to do is go to a theme park because they're having to pay for a new roof or structural damage to their home, or getting rid of the 200-year-old oak tree that fell down and crossed the street. Or there's still places. There are still places in Tampa that are flooded. There's still places in Tampa inland, not just on the coast, inland, that are still flooded. So this is going to be something that is going to impact people's desire, if not just financially, but their desire to go to a theme park, unless they just decide, screw it, I want something fun. That is a possibility. But what I would recommend is if there are attractions out there in the Florida area that are listening, anything you can do to make people feel safe and to help them a little bit financially, now would be the time to do it. Now, I'm not saying to profit off of misery. What I am saying is recognize that the financial challenges and the emotional challenges are there, and treat your guests, treat your customers with as much respect as you can, so that you can, again, play the long game. When they go back and say XYZ Park was so nice to us, they gave us, they gave us a $3 or a $10 gas card when we came to visit their park. Finding a station that's open and has gas is another challenge, but something that's going to benefit them, something that's going to help them in their real lives. Because we in the attractions industry, we are in the business of creating fantasy. But what we have to recognize is, once you set foot off of our property, reality is sitting there, and we need to make certain that when people come to escape for a little while, when they go back to that sense of reality, they're not hit in the face. And because if we don't look at that, if we don't take that into consideration, they're not going to come to escape. They're going to stay and sit in their misery, because they're going to feel they either can't afford it, or they're just not in the mood, or they just don't want to travel, or they don't have the gas to get there, or whatever. So I think it's really important for everybody in the attractions industry, certainly in the customer service side, to recognize that the guests that you're going to have over the next couple of months in the state of Florida are coming from not the best place. And even if they didn't have damage themselves, someone they know did. And so make sure that your customer service team is compassionate. And even if your customer service team themselves had damage, make sure that, if you can give them any sort of training in regards to that kind of communication and that kind of compassion, it would not be wasted time or money, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. I really think that I think this is something that I think we need to, again, learn from the pandemic, or I think sometimes we're too quick to maybe normalize this or get too used to things like that. But I think these events are getting more frequent, and they are getting worse. And I think that it's time to add training, or I get do what you can do. Again, look back at your crisis plan, but do what you can do, either adding training or helping the guests out, or even just, I think of the staff side, because it's such an interesting environment where you have to take care of your guests, but you also can't take care of your guests if your staff doesn't have a place to live or they're worried about their homes.
First, remove the plank from your own eye. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Philip, because one of the things that has always helped me in the past when I was working in parks was actually the act of making a child smile would actually help raise my spirits as well. So once again, that's a double-edged sword. Some people, not everybody's like that, but for me, having the tools to make someone else's day unexpectedly brighter is a wonderful healing moment for me when I'm having challenges or troubles. So that's why I suggest, if there's anything parks can do or attractions can do to provide those tools for their staff, and maybe it's give every staff member, give them 10 gallons of gas when they come in, because you've got gas pumps on property. Everyone does.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe
Exactly.
there's that. I don't know, and I have to
Yeah.
make sure that we find that balance. I'm not saying that's exactly what to do, but just at least consider it. That's the most important part, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think this is another one of those situations, like so much of what we talked about, where it needs to be adjusted to the situation. I know several cast members that were provided lodging in hurricane-safe resorts because their homes were compromised, and so that's a great thing to do. But if you're an attraction that doesn't have a hotel that you can give to your staff, that's a different situation. So I do think too, I'm sure part of the reason that Disney reopened so quickly is because they have so many guests they have to take care of. So
Right.
essentially, you're also responsible for a bunch of people who are not used to Florida and maybe didn't know they were gonna, I don't know. I mean, you never know how much a guest knows or doesn't know.
They were
right?
here for 2 weeks. Say they had planned a 2-week holiday, which is not uncommon at Disney, and people had planned a 2-week holiday and had no idea that Milton was going to be the monster that he became. So.
And they've never been through a hurricane before. I mean, there's a lot of, I think you can see that, I think, more with Disney than so. But, I think thinking about what you can do that fits your particular situation would be my recommendation. But
yeah, I agree 100%. I agree 100%.
So,
and, when we talk about climate change, it's not just about heat anymore. And this is a perfect example. So it may mean that we need that the major attractions need to rethink and retheme and replan. I don't know what the answer is, but it's not changing. It is changing, but it's changing in the direction that we've been afraid it was going for quite some time. So when the reports come out next year and they say, well, we had kind of a weak fall and winter because of the weather, well, weather is only an excuse for 1 or 2 years. You got to start thinking. You got to start planning ahead and planning around it. So I don't know how you plan around a hurricane yet, but
well, that is actually the last thing one of the last things I thought was important to bring up. Really is that I think we talked about this way early. I feel like we did, or maybe we just talked off. I forget, but so many conversations, I forget. But I at some point. We did discuss the news that came out a while back about how this hurricane season was going to be the worst in Florida on record. And we didn't see it. And then now here it is, right? And that, is coupled with, again, one of the most hot summers on record that, like to your point, where we just heard all the parks talk about how the summer numbers were down and they were blaming that, and well, now it's hurricane season, and so now you're effectively taking 2 big chunks of the year where you're having weather-related disturbances, and they are going to get worse, which we already know because we've already had reports coming out that next year's hurricanes could be worse, already. So it is going to be a big problem for the attractions in that area, which partly is why I was always so surprised. I mean, this is one of my arguments way back when Disney announced their expansion plans, and so much of it was in Florida. And this is one of my concerns is, well, if you're going to have half the year potentially knocked out, why are we building there? And I mean, your point was the infrastructure is still more infrastructure there than anywhere else. So shoot where the ducks are flying. But I do think it's a concern.
And I think it's a concern, and I think it's now a long range concern. It could also be why Universal is looking at so many satellite locations, that they're taking the opposite approach. I doubt that a hurricane is going to hit in Las Vegas.
Universe. Yeah.
Epic Universe, yes. But again, that's the infrastructure side. But they've also got, unlike Disney, they're also opening parks and attractions at various locations around the country.
Yep.
So and we may discover that the tropical charm of Florida is no longer exactly what people are looking for. Maybe they're looking for the safety of Minneapolis. So
well,
so Valley Fair, you're safe. There you go, Valley Fair, you're rocking it.
Well, moving on. Briefly, or just we have about 5 minutes left.
You evacuated out of the country. You evacuated out of the country. So
I know earlier when you said for international guests, I'm like, what hurricane? What? What's going on? I don't know. Okay, moving on. Just briefly here, there's one story I wanted to mention from the Hollywood Reporter. It says Halloween wars. Theme parks are fighting for bigger share of scream economy. Disney, Universal, and Six Flags are upping the ante with pricey new experiences to grab greater market share of a $12 billion seasonal industry. And of course, it starts off with a quote from John Murdy, our great friend, John Murdy, who says, who just talks about Halloween. I'm quoted extensively in this article, so I guess that's a little bit of vested interest in sharing this article. But there's quite a good, I guess, a veritable who's who. Knott's is in here, Universal's in here. There's quotes also from our friend Martin and the TEA Theme Global Index report, something that exactly what we talked about on the show. But essentially, this is a really good article that's geared for the mainstream public that outlines the expansion of Halloween at the parks and how much it is becoming something the parks are reliant on, which is what we were just talking about. But I am curious. I mean, it's interesting we talk about this, but it also comes in the lens of, all the Halloween events in Florida were just disrupted from the hurricane. And
they all lost at least a weekend.
Plus damage to, and so, I really gave Universal Orlando a hard time for not having any temporary stanchions and props and scenic pieces out for the scare zones. Well, they're probably laughing at me now because they're like, well, if we had anything out, anything that you had out or that isn't, kind of anchored down, it's now, it would, I'm sure they would have put it in storage, but, anything that is, smaller pieces like that, even if they're in storage, can be damaged in hurricanes like this. And so
absolutely. And I have to say, I can't talk about details, but I do have multiple clients that have irreparable damage done to some of their scenic pieces because of this. And we're actually planning this week. We have multiple planning meetings to come together and figure out how can we cobble together what we still have left. And by the way, this is not my first time doing this. I did this when I was at Busch too. We had to completely redo an entire haunted attraction that was in a giant tent that collapsed. And we had to move what salvageable scenic pieces we could to another location. So that's another very important part of what attractions need to do after this kind of catastrophe, is kind of figure out what can we make work with what we have. Yeah.
Well, I think that, again, back to the planning thing, I think that in light of all this information, this is a really big, I think to me, this is, especially for our audience, a big piece of it is the planning for your seasonal activations like this, because, if Halloween, as we're pointing out in these news articles and our reporting, is becoming a bigger piece of the revenue equation for parks, but Halloween in most of these parks is a temporary installation. And again, we're looking back at places that Universal can, has sound stages that they can build stuff in, and sound stages are more weatherproofed, not impenetrable, but more weatherproof. But a lot of the attractions do not have sound stages, and they are built or more outdoors, as you mentioned with the tent, and so they're very vulnerable. And then what happens if you need all this money for your event, but then you plan it in a way as to you can't protect it from the weather, and then you lose the ability to monetize that because you can't open, or for whatever damages to this or that. I think that's a whole element that we're going to need to start planning for even next year, for next year's designs.
And actually, maybe that's something that we can chat about in the bonus content that we're just about to record, because we are out of time for this episode. And I'm sorry I yammered on and bemoaned the fact that I'm in the midst of a hurricane. Suffice to say, we were incredibly lucky, and all is well in the Swenson Swearingen household, and the world that we live in was not rocked completely. My heart goes out to those who had significantly more damage, but Floridians are resilient. We kind of know it when we move here, and I'm hoping that everybody can recover quickly and safely. And if there's anybody who's listening outside the Florida area and you have the ability to help in any way, not to benefit me in any way, shape, or form, but to benefit those who have lost their homes or who are in the process of dealing with a 4-foot flood surge. Actually, it was a 12-foot flood surge, which came into many people's homes and left anywhere from 4 to 6 feet, not inches, feet of water in their first floors. If there's any way to help with American Red Cross or any of the reputable charitable organizations that are helping Florida, and if you're able to do so, please consider it, because there's a bunch of people who all work in our industry who are hurting, and not just because their parks are closed or have reduced hours. So this has been Green Tag Theme Park in 30. Sorry to end on such a downer, but it's been a rough time, and thank you for listening. And hopefully next week we will have significantly more cheerful news. So on behalf of Philip Hernandez and myself, Scott Swenson, this is Green Tagged Theme Park in 30, and we will see you next week.